the story of the Bosnian War does not begin with the crack of a rifle or the thunder of artillery, but with the slow, almost imperceptible cracking of a fragile mosaic, a mosaic of cultures, religions, and identities that had coexisted for centuries in a delicate balance that outsiders often misunderstood, a balance that seemed eternal until the pressures of history, nationalism, and political ambition shattered it apart. Bosnia and Herzegovina, a land of emerald rivers, snow-capped mountains, ancient Ottoman bridges, and austere Austro-Hungarian fortresses, carried within its borders an extraordinary diversity born of centuries of empires rising and falling, borders shifting, and populations blending. Muslims, Serbs, Croats, Jews, Roma, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, Sunni Muslims, Bosnia was not a melting pot but a layered tapestry, woven with threads that retained their distinct colors while still holding the pattern together. It was a place where minarets and church steeples rose side by side, where families celebrated both Eid and Christmas within the same neighborhoods, where people spoke the same language but carried surnames that whispered their histories. This coexistence was neither perfect nor free of tension, but for much of the 20th century, especially under the flag of socialist Yugoslavia, it was stable, even proud. Yet beneath the surface, the region carried deep memories of Ottoman rule, of Austro-Hungarian administration, of World War I spark in Sarajevo, of World War II's brutal ethnic massacres and partisan resistance, and finally of the post-war Yugoslav unity built under Tito's authoritarian but stabilizing leadership. These memories never disappeared, they merely slept. And when Tito died in 1980, the great weight that had kept old animosities in check began to lift, slowly at first, then with alarming speed, as economic decline, rising nationalism, and political fragmentation created an atmosphere ripe for conflict. In Bosnia, with its unique blend of identities, the cracks emerged most dangerously. Throughout the 1980s, Yugoslavia began to unravel. Inflation spiraled, jobs disappeared, and the once celebrated idea of a unified Yugoslav identity weakened as each republic increasingly turned inward, searching for someone to blame. Politicians who had once spoken of brotherhood and unity now discovered that nationalism was a powerful tool, an intoxicating instrument to rally support, distract from economic hardship, and elevate personal ambition. Nowhere was this clearer than in Serbia, where Slobodan Milosevic rose to power through fiery rhetoric promising to defend Serbs everywhere, even beyond Serbia's borders. His speeches, broadcast across Yugoslavia, awakened old fears and old desires, the fear of domination by others, and the desire for a greater Serbia that would unite Serbs into one state. Croatian nationalism surged in response, led by Franjo Tudman, who appealed to centuries-old grievances and dreams of independence. In this rising tide of nationalist fervor, Bosnia found itself trapped, not because it sought conflict, but because it embodied the very multi-ethnic coexistence that nationalism sought to destroy. Bosnia could not split itself neatly into ethnic lines, its people were too interwoven. Towns, villages, and even families included Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks living side by side, sometimes in the same apartment buildings, attending the same schools, intermarrying, sharing traditions. As Serbia and Croatia began pulling their respective ethnic groups into political alignment, Bosnia became a battleground of influence. Serb leaders in Bosnia echoed Milosevic's rhetoric, warning that an independent Bosnia would mean the oppression of Serbs. Bosniak leaders, led by Alija Izetbegović, argued for a democratic, pluralistic Bosnia that remained neutral and united. Croat leaders, encouraged by Zagreb, had their own ambitions for connections to Croatia. The stage was being set for collision, for Bosnia was not simply a territory, it was a symbolic prize for all sides, a place where competing visions of identity could not coexist without conflict. As nationalism hardened across Yugoslavia like ice spreading across a lake, Bosnia stood at the center, aware that if the ice cracked, it would crack under its feet first. By the early 1990s, tensions had reached a breaking point. Slovenia and Croatia declared independence in 1991, triggering brief but intense wars. Bosnia watched closely, aware that its own decision would ignite something far more catastrophic. The Yugoslav People's Army, once a multinational force symbolizing unity, had become increasingly dominated by Serb officers loyal to Belgrade. Tanks rolled into Slovenia and Croatia, and in their wake came the first waves of refugees, carrying stories of burning villages, snipers, and ethnic cleansing. Bosnia knew these horrors all too well from its distant memories, but now they were present, immediate, unavoidable. Sarajevo, once a city known for hosting the 1984 Winter Olympics in a celebration of international harmony, now felt the tremors of a different kind of historical moment. Conversations in cafes grew tense. Friends who had celebrated weddings together now found themselves arguing about politics, identity, and fear. People whispered about stockpiling food, about leaving the city for the mountains, about whether to flee or stay. A sense of foreboding settled over the capital like a low-hanging fog, silent, cold, and impossible to escape. Bosnia's referendum on independence in March 1992 became the spark that lit the fuse. Bosniaks and Croats overwhelmingly voted to leave Yugoslavia, envisioning a sovereign, multi-ethnic state. Bosnian Serb leaders, encouraged and armed by Belgrade, boycotted the vote and immediately began organizing armed militias. Within days, barricades appeared in Sarajevo. Snipers took positions in high-rise buildings. The Yugoslav People's Army began withdrawing from Croatia and repositioning itself around Bosnia, bringing with it heavy weaponry that would soon be turned on the very people who once considered the soldiers their neighbors. Bosnia's independence was recognized internationally on April 6, 1992, the same day that violence erupted in force across the country. The date marked the official beginning of the Bosnian War, but for those living through it, the war had begun long before. It began in the whispers of fear, in the fracture of friendships, in the rise of politicians who traded unity for power, in the gradual, relentless corrosion of trust. The day Sarajevo descended into chaos was simply the moment the world could no longer ignore what had been building for years. The descent into war was not a sudden explosion but a creeping avalanche. In towns and villages across Bosnia, neighbors who had shared bread now faced each other across barricades. Serb militias, backed by the Yugoslav army, seized high ground and strategic crossroads. Croat forces formed their own enclaves. Bosniaks scrambled to organize defenses with limited weapons and even less experience. The institutions meant to protect civilians crumbled under the weight of conflicting loyalties. Police forces split along ethnic lines. Local administrations fractured. Fear became the dominant reality, fear of being targeted because of a name, a religion, an accent, or even the side of the street one lived on. The once interwoven communities of Bosnia began to unravel violently, as nationalist leaders on all sides exploited fear to mobilize support. Propaganda flooded television and radio, painting other ethnic groups as threats, invaders, traitors. Rumors spread like wildfire, each one stoking panic and justifying preemptive violence. The country that had once prided itself on diversity was now fragmenting into pieces shaped by fear, hatred, and the ruthless logic of ethnic division. Sarajevo, the symbolic heart of Bosnia, felt the first full weight of the storm. On April 6, a peaceful demonstration for unity turned deadly when snipers opened fire on the crowd. Panic spread through the streets. People ran for cover as bullets flew from rooftops and windows. A city known for its cafes, music, and cultural vibrancy suddenly became a battlefield, trapped between forces seeking to control it. As Serb forces encircled Sarajevo from the surrounding hills, the city found itself under siege, the longest siege in modern European history. But in Section 1 of this long story, the siege has not yet been fully realized. Instead, it hangs like a looming prophecy over the Bosnian capital. People sensed what was coming. They could feel it in the silence of the streets, in the empty shelves at grocery stores, in the sudden absence of familiar faces who had fled to safer towns, in the pounding of distant artillery echoing across the mountains. Bosnia was sliding into darkness, a darkness fed by history, by resentments buried but never forgotten, by political manipulation, by fear, and by the simple, devastating truth that coexistence, beautiful as it was, had become a fragile dream in a land scarred by too many competing truths. Thus the prologue to the Bosnian War closes not with resolution but with the unsettling certainty that the storm has only just begun. Bosnia, the land of layered identities and shared histories, now stands on the edge of the abyss, pulled toward a conflict that will unravel communities, break families, destroy cities, and reveal the darkest shadows of Europe at the end of the 20th century. The war will not simply be fought with weapons but with memories, fears, and the deep wounds of history itself, wounds that now begin to reopen as the first sounds of war echo across the mountains that have witnessed centuries of human triumph and tragedy. And as Bosnia takes its first steps into the nightmare, the world watches, a world unsure whether to intervene, to negotiate, to condemn, or simply to observe from a distance as a continent once again confronts the ghosts it thought it had laid to rest. The fall of Yugoslavia was not a single event but a long, uneven, and deeply painful unraveling, a slow-motion collapse of a nation that once seemed indestructible, a federation stitched together by wartime sacrifice, socialist idealism, and the iron will of Marshal Josip Broz Tito, and when that stitching began to tear in the early 1980s, the weakening threads exposed long-buried resentments, competing nationalisms, and structural imbalances that no political institution could contain. To understand the Bosnian War, one must first understand how Yugoslavia died, how a country admired for its stability, multiculturalism, and independence from both the Soviet Union and the West decayed into ethnic strife, political opportunism, and violence. After Tito's death in 1980, Yugoslavia entered a period of uncertainty. Tito had been the unifying force, a charismatic leader whose authority had subdued ethnic tensions, kept nationalists in check, and guided Yugoslavia through decades of Cold War diplomacy. Without him, the presidency rotated among republics, creating a leadership structure too fragmented to respond effectively to growing crises. At the same time, the economy began a steep decline. Foreign debt soared. Unemployment rose. Factories closed. Inflation spiraled out of control. The prosperity and relative comfort that Yugoslav citizens once enjoyed evaporated quickly, leaving frustration, fear, and a sense that the country's best days were behind it. In times of economic hardship, people often look for explanations, and leaders eager to gain power often point fingers at convenient targets. That is exactly what happened in Yugoslavia. Political elites in Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia began reviving nationalist rhetoric, claiming their republics were being exploited or oppressed by others. Serbia, the largest republic, became the epicenter of nationalist revival under the ambitious and calculating leadership of Slobodan Milosevic. In 1987, during a visit to Kosovo, then a province with an Albanian majority, Milosevic delivered a speech promising to defend Serbs everywhere, instantly catapulting himself into political stardom. His message resonated deeply with many Serbs who felt humiliated by historical defeats, demographic changes, and fears of losing influence in a multi-ethnic federation. Milosevic seized on these sentiments, reshaping the Serbian political landscape through purges of moderate leaders, control of media narratives, and assertions of Serbian victimhood. His rise marked a turning point. While previous Yugoslav leaders had promoted unity, Milosevic promoted division, arguing, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that the survival of the Serb people required political dominance and territorial expansion. As Serbia tightened control over its autonomous provinces, Kosovo and Vojvodina, and influenced Montenegrin politics, other republics viewed this centralization as a threat. Slovenia and Croatia, both economically stronger and culturally closer to Western Europe, began advocating for greater autonomy, market reforms, and democratic pluralism. Croatian intellectual Franjo Tudman emerged as a champion of Croatian nationalism, arguing that Croatia had the right to define its destiny independent of Belgrade. Political multi-party elections in 1990 became turning points in both Serbia and Croatia. Nationalist parties won overwhelming victories. Old fears surfaced, memories of World War II atrocities, in which Croat Ustase militias had committed genocidal crimes against Serbs, and Serb Chetniks retaliated with their own massacres, suddenly found new life in political rhetoric. Propaganda flourished across Yugoslavia, fueled by state-controlled media. Television channels broadcast stories exaggerating or fabricating threats from other ethnic groups. Newspapers printed sensationalist headlines accusing neighboring republics of plotting genocide. Rumors spread rapidly, turning economic grievances into ethnic anxieties. Across villages and towns, places where people had lived peacefully for decades, conversations grew tense. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Politicians fanned the flames intentionally, understanding that fear was an effective tool for consolidating power. As these tensions grew, small conflicts erupted in Croatia between Serb minorities and Croatian police forces. Roadblocks appeared. Weapons circulated. Paramilitary groups formed, some trained and armed by factions within the Yugoslav People's Army. When Croatia declared independence in June 1991, the Yugoslav Federation effectively shattered. Slovenia, also declaring independence, faced a brief 10-day war, but its ethnic homogeneity spared it from the prolonged violence that would engulf Croatia and later Bosnia. Croatia, however, descended into a full-scale war. Towns like Vukovar and Dubrovnik became symbols of destruction. Vukovar was reduced to rubble after a months-long siege. Dubrovnik, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was shelled despite having no strategic value. These early conflicts demonstrated the ruthlessness of nationalist ambitions and foreshadowed what awaited Bosnia, where ethnic boundaries were far more entangled and violence would reach unimaginable levels. The Yugoslav People's Army, once the pride of the Federation, transformed during this period from a multi-ethnic institution into a tool of Serbian nationalism. Many non-Serb officers resigned or defected as the army increasingly took orders from Milosevic's circle. Tanks and artillery, once intended to defend Yugoslavia from external threats, were now used against its own citizens. Bosnia watched the dissolution of Yugoslavia with growing dread. If Slovenia and Croatia had suffered violence despite clearer ethnic separations, what would happen to Bosnia, where Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks lived intermingled in every city, town, and valley? Bosnia had no simple path to align itself with any single nationalist project without causing catastrophe. Serb leaders in Bosnia, led by Radovan Karadzic, warned that if Bosnia pursued independence, Serbs would declare their own state. Croat leaders in Bosnia communicated similar intentions. Bosniak leaders pleaded for unity and warned that ethnic partition would destroy the country. By late 1991, Bosnia was caught between competing forces pulling it apart. Serbia wanted Bosnian Serbs to join a Greater Serbia. Croatia quietly encouraged Bosnian Croats to align with Zagreb. Meanwhile, Bosniaks sought a multi-ethnic Bosnia, but their political power was insufficient to counter the rising dominance of nationalist military forces forming on all sides. Tensions escalated further as paramilitary groups roamed the countryside. Serbian paramilitaries, such as Arkon's Tigers and Seselj Chetniks, began infiltrating Bosnia, spreading fear with targeted killings, intimidation, and displays of power. Croatian paramilitaries also mobilized, though initially with less coordination. Arms stockpiled by the Yugoslav army mysteriously fell into the hands of nationalist groups. Villages in northeastern Bosnia reported masked men patrolling roads. Gunshots echoed at night. Families whispered about leaving while they still could. The countryside felt the tension of an approaching storm. In the cities, political rallies turned violent. Demonstrations escalated into clashes. Police forces split along ethnic lines, making law enforcement unpredictable and often dangerous. In Sarajevo, multi-ethnic protests demanding peace filled the streets, but optimism faded quickly as armed militias asserted control. The assassination of a Serbian wedding guest in Sarajevo in March 1992, considered the first officially recognized casualty of the Bosnian War, sparked outrage among Serbs and signaled that violence had finally crossed into Bosnia. Within days, barricades went up across the capital. Checkpoints guarded by militias replaced peaceful neighborhoods. People rushed to buy flour, oil, candles, and medicine. Hospitals began preparing for war. As the cracks widened, international diplomacy proved ineffective. European community negotiators attempted peace plans, but each proposal collapsed. Serbia demanded territorial guarantees for Bosnian Serbs. Croatia pushed for its own influence. Bosniaks resisted any partitioning that would sacrifice the multi-ethnic character of the state. The international community underestimated how deeply nationalism had taken root and how quickly violence could spread through a country as diverse as Bosnia. They failed to grasp that once Yugoslavia fell, the logic holding Bosnia together would fall with it. By early 1992, independence for Bosnia became both inevitable and dangerous, a necessity for survival but also a trigger for war. The referendum on independence, boycotted by most Bosnian Serbs, was the final rupture. When the results overwhelmingly favored independence, Serb leaders declared their own separatist state, Republika Srpska. With support from the Yugoslav army, they moved to seize territory through force. Artillery was positioned around Sarajevo. Tanks rolled into eastern Bosnia. Roadblocks appeared across strategic routes. What had been political posturing turned into mobilization for war. Bosnia's government, underprepared and underarmed, scrambled to respond. Its military forces were minimal, fragmented, and poorly supplied. The Yugoslav army had confiscated many weapons from Bosnian defense structures, leaving the republic vulnerable. Bosniaks formed hastily organized units, often relying on smuggled weapons or makeshift supplies. Croat units aligned with Zagreb also mobilized, creating alliances of convenience that would later fracture violently. The early confrontations were chaotic, sporadic, and deeply personal. Villages known for interethnic marriages suddenly became battlegrounds as neighbors turned enemies under pressure from external militias and propaganda. The fall of Yugoslavia had created a vacuum, one filled immediately by armed groups seeking to carve out territory through violence, intimidation, and ethnic cleansing. As 1992 progressed, the idea of Yugoslavia no longer existed in any meaningful political or emotional sense. What remained was a shattered landscape where people now clung to ethnic identities as shields against fear. The country that had once prided itself on unity, where children in Sarajevo grew up learning Serbo-Croatian in schools adorned with both Islamic and Christian symbols, was now dissolving into armed enclaves. Each of the former republics emerged as independent nations, but Bosnia's independence came at the highest cost. With the death of Yugoslavia came the birth of one of Europe's most brutal wars since World War II. The mosaic that had once been Bosnia was no longer a symbol of cultural harmony but a fragile structure strained to the breaking point by political manipulation and historical grievances. The fall of Yugoslavia was not simply the collapse of a country, it was the collapse of an idea, the idea that people with different religions, histories, and traditions could coexist peacefully under a shared national identity. As that idea crumbled, so too did the bonds between communities. And with those bonds broken, Bosnia stood alone, caught between rising powers, trapped by geography and history, hurtling toward a war whose brutality would shock the world and leave scars that would take generations to heal. The siege of Sarajevo began not with a single declaration of war or a sudden clash of armies, but with a gradual tightening of a noose around a city that had once symbolized coexistence, tolerance, and the vibrant cultural heartbeat of Yugoslavia, and as the spring of 1992 unfolded, that noose drew tighter with each passing day until Sarajevo, a city of poets, students, musicians, athletes, scholars, merchants, and families, found itself trapped inside the longest siege in modern European history. A 1,425-day nightmare that transformed everyday life into an unending struggle for survival, dignity, and hope. Before the siege fully descended, Sarajevo's residents sensed the storm gathering. The city that had proudly hosted the 1984 Winter Olympics now felt the uneasy tremor of political collapse and rising nationalism. Barricades appeared overnight on April 5. Gunfire crackled unpredictably. Rumors spread of snipers positioned in the hills overlooking the city, hills that had previously offered peaceful views of red-roofed homes, cobblestone streets, and the winding Miljacka River. The assassination of two young women, a Serb and a Bosniak, during a massive peace demonstration marked the symbolic breaking point. Their deaths were a message that Sarajevo's innocence had ended. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, the city was encircled. Roads leading out of Sarajevo were blocked by tanks and checkpoints manned by Bosnian Serb forces. Water reservoirs and power stations on the hills fell into enemy hands. Artillery units dug into forested ridges, their gun barrels pointed directly at the heart of the capital. Snipers took positions in high-rise buildings and abandoned apartments, transforming balconies, attics, and broken windows into instruments of terror. Residents awoke to a new reality: they were surrounded. As the siege tightened, panic turned into desperate attempts to flee. Cars choked the roads, but many were turned back by barricades or gunfire. Buses stopped running. The airport, controlled by the Yugoslav army and later monitored by the UN, became inaccessible to ordinary civilians. Those who stayed had no choice but to prepare for a life cut off from the outside world. Within days, basic services collapsed. Electricity flickered and disappeared. Tap water ran dry. Food shortages began immediately. Sarajevo, once a cosmopolitan city with cafes, bookstores, cinemas, and thriving neighborhoods, now faced medieval conditions under the shadow of modern warfare. The city was plunged into darkness as night fell, complete, terrifying darkness punctuated only by the distant flashes of artillery or the sudden crack of a sniper's shot. People moved cautiously, hugging walls, running across open intersections known as sniper alleys, where even a few seconds of exposure meant risking death. Snipers did not always target specific individuals, sometimes they fired simply to instill fear, to remind civilians that their lives depended on the whims of unseen gunmen hidden in the hills. The city's rhythms changed. People rose before dawn to collect water from mountain springs or fire-damaged pipes. Others scavenged wood from ruined buildings to use for heating and cooking. Gardens behind apartment blocks became sources of vegetables. Entire social norms transformed overnight into survival laws: never stand near windows, never walk in the open, never wear bright clothing, and always listen for the peculiar silence that meant artillery fire was seconds away. The early months of the siege were marked by a desperate attempt to understand its scale. Some Sarajevans believed the conflict would last weeks, perhaps months, but not years. After all, Sarajevo had always been a symbol of multicultural coexistence, and many residents clung to the belief that the world would not allow such a city to be destroyed. But the world watched, debated, hesitated, and offered words instead of action. In the meantime, the violence escalated. Mortar shells rained down on marketplaces, hospitals, playgrounds, and breadlines. The shelling was relentless, indiscriminate, and deeply psychological, forcing residents to live with the knowledge that death could fall from the sky at any moment. One of the most terrifying aspects of the siege was the way in which ordinary places became deadly. The walk to school became a gamble. A trip to the bakery could be a death sentence. Standing in line for potable water became one of the most dangerous activities in the city. Parents taught their children how to identify the sound of incoming shells, explaining the difference between the eerie whistle of a mortar and the deeper rumble of artillery fired from surrounding mountains. Children learned to throw themselves to the ground instinctively, to freeze when they heard gunfire, to sleep in hallways where fewer walls meant less risk of being trapped under rubble. Childhood itself became a battlefield. Hospitals, overwhelmed by the constant influx of wounded civilians, struggled to operate under impossible conditions. Without steady electricity, surgeons performed operations by candlelight or flashlight. They improvised medical solutions using limited supplies, sterilizing instruments over open flames, using rags as bandages, and relying on decades-old equipment. Doctors and nurses, regardless of ethnicity, worked side by side, performing miracles in rooms where windows were covered with sandbags and plastic sheeting to protect against sniper fire. Blood banks ran low. Painkillers were reserved for the most critical cases. Patients sometimes died waiting for treatment simply because the journey to the hospital was too dangerous. Ambulance drivers risked their lives to navigate streets exposed to sniper fire. Journalists later described Sarajevo's hospitals as both sanctuaries of compassion and scenes of unfathomable suffering. As the siege continued, the psychological weight of isolation began to crush the city. With roads blocked and no safe passage in or out, Sarajevans felt abandoned by the world. UN convoys arrived sporadically, delivering food, medicines, and supplies, but never enough. The blue helmets patrolling the streets became symbols of international hesitation, present, but restricted by mandates that prevented them from confronting the besieging forces. Many Sarajevans viewed their presence with bitter irony. Foreign soldiers stood on their streets, but they could not stop the shelling, could not stop the killing. International politicians condemned the violence in speeches but hesitated to act militarily. Peace negotiations dragged on endlessly while mortars continued to fall. The world's paralysis became part of the siege itself, another layer of oppression, another source of despair. Yet even in the darkness, Sarajevo refused to die. The city spirit, the same spirit that had once made it a cultural capital of Yugoslavia, manifested in extraordinary acts of resilience. Artists held secret exhibitions in basements. Musicians played classical concerts in ruined buildings, their music echoing through bombed-out shells of concert halls. Theatre troupes performed underground plays using makeshift stages and flashlights for spotlights. Writers kept diaries, capturing the daily horror and the stubborn will to survive. Journalists smuggled footage out of the city, showing the world the truth: families huddling in basements, old men crossing streets crouched behind garbage cans, children playing soccer in courtyards shattered by mortar fire, nurses carrying wounded civilians through corridors lined with shattered glass. Sarajevans transformed survival into a form of resistance. They dressed in their best clothes to get water, refusing to let war strip them of dignity. They celebrated birthdays with bread crusts and powdered milk. They organized schools in basements, determined that their children would learn even if they had to recite lessons under candlelight while artillery boomed overhead. The siege also reshaped relationships and identities. In a city where ethnic diversity had once been celebrated, the war forced people to see each other through the distorted lens of conflict. Some friendships fractured under pressure. Others grew stronger. Many people rejected nationalist divisions entirely, insisting that their shared suffering mattered more than political rhetoric. Sarajevo became a paradoxical example of unity under siege. While nationalist leaders outside the city demanded ethnic separation, inside the city, Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and others fought, survived, and endured together. They were bound not by ideology but by shared terror, shared hunger, and shared hope. This unity infuriated the nationalist forces encircling the city, which sought to erase multi-ethnic coexistence and replace it with ethnic homogeneity achieved through violence. As years passed, the siege settled into a horrifying rhythm. Each day carried the same questions: will water be available today? Will the power come on for an hour? Will the bakery be shelled again? Will the snipers fire on the tram line? Will tonight be the night artillery rains down from Mount Trebevic or Mount Igman? People stopped asking when the war would end, they asked only how they would make it through another day. The seasons changed, but the siege did not. Snow fell on ruined buildings. Spring brought flowers pushing through cracks in shattered pavement. Summer heat baked the city's dust and ash. Autumn winds carried the smell of burning homes and forests ignited by shelling. Sarajevo lived through all of it, trapped in a cycle of destruction and resilience. And yet, through everything, the hunger, the terror, the exhaustion, Sarajevo endured. Its people endured. They refused to surrender. They refused to abandon the belief that their city, with its centuries-old mixture of faiths and cultures, deserved to survive. But the cost of that endurance was staggering: thousands dead, thousands more wounded, generations scarred by trauma, a city reduced to rubble and memories of what it once was. The siege of Sarajevo began as a tightening noose around a proud city. It would become a symbol of brutality, of resilience, of failure by the international community, and of the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to let darkness erase their humanity. The siege had begun, and its shadow would stretch across for long years, shaping the soul of Bosnia and revealing the deepest, darkest truths of a Europe that had promised never again but found itself once more watching genocide unfold on its own soil. Ethnic cleansing in Bosnia did not erupt as a sudden, chaotic frenzy but unfolded as a calculated, methodical strategy, one planned behind political doors, executed by soldiers and paramilitaries, and justified through poisonous propaganda that turned neighbors into enemies and everyday citizens into targets. And once this strategy began in the spring of 1992, it spread across the country like a dark stain, leaving behind burned houses, emptied villages, mass graves, and memories of terror that would sear themselves into the collective consciousness of Europe, reminding the world that genocide was not a relic of the past but a living threat lurking beneath the veneer of civilization. Bosnia, with its intertwined ethnic landscape, became the crucible in which the cruel logic of ethnic purity manifested with unprecedented ferocity. In towns where Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats had lived side by side for centuries, people awoke to find themselves categorized, hunted, or expelled based on the names on their identification cards or the shape of their places of worship. The process began subtly, then violently. Lists were drawn up, checkpoints erected, weapons distributed to local militias who once drank coffee with the very people they would soon terrorize. Radio broadcasts spewed hatred, describing Bosniaks as fundamentalists seeking to impose Islamic rule, Croats as fascists reviving the crimes of World War II, Serbs as aggressors bent on domination. In the vacuum left by Yugoslavia's collapse, truth became irrelevant, replaced by narratives designed to ignite fear. Fear bred suspicion, suspicion bred violence, and violence, once unleashed, fed itself endlessly. The village of Armasi stood as one of the earliest horrifying examples of how ethnic cleansing operated on the ground. On April 16, 1993, Croatian forces surrounded the village and attacked at dawn, killing more than 100 Bosniak civilians, women, children, elderly, burning homes, preventing escape, and systematically destroying the community. But Armasi was only one of many such massacres. In eastern Bosnia, Serb forces backed by the Yugoslav People's Army launched coordinated operations to seize towns along the Drina River. The aim was clear: create a contiguous Serb territory by removing the Bosniak population. Town after town fell: Foča, Visegrad, Zvornik, Brigatica, Bračunac, and with each fall came acts of unimaginable cruelty. Homes were looted and burned. Mosques, some centuries old, were dynamited to erase cultural identity. Men and teenage boys were separated from women and children at checkpoints, a dividing tactic that became chillingly consistent across the region. Many of those taken away were executed in forests, riversides, or abandoned industrial sites. Others were sent to detention camps, where torture, starvation, and humiliation became daily realities. Women and girls were subjected to rape on a scale so widespread and systematic that it became one of the war's defining horrors. Rape was weaponized, not as an act of individual brutality but as a deliberate tool of terror and ethnic domination, intended to shatter families, stigmatize survivors, and destroy the social fabric of communities. Perhaps nowhere did the machinery of ethnic cleansing operate with more chilling efficiency than in Prajda, a town that would become infamous for its network of concentration camps, Omarskar, Keraterm, and Trinopolia. Once a relatively peaceful industrial municipality, Prajda descended into hell almost overnight in April 1992, when Bosnian Serb forces seized control and immediately began targeting the non-Serb population. Bosniaks and Croats were ordered to mark their houses with white sheets and to wear white armbands, a symbolic act of subjugation that evoked the darkest chapters of Europe's past. Entire families were rounded up. Men were separated and taken to camps where they were tortured, beaten, starved, and forced to endure conditions designed to break them physically and psychologically. Women and children were detained, displaced, or subjected to sexual violence. Journalists later described Omarskar as a place where human beings were reduced to shadows, gaunt, terrified figures crowded into iron-roofed rooms where temperatures soared, and where guards inflicted random, sadistic brutality. Survivors recounted scenes of horror: men beaten to death for sport, prisoners forced to consume salt without water, executions carried out at night, bodies transported to secret burial sites in trucks. These camps existed not merely to detain but to terrorize, to ensure that those who survived would never return, and to erase the presence of entire ethnic groups from the region. In eastern Bosnia, Visegrad became notorious for atrocities committed by Serbian paramilitaries such as the White Eagles and Ars Vetnici, who terrorized the Bosniak population through beatings, killings, and rapes. The Mrnd Pasir Sokolović Bridge, a stunning Ottoman-era structure immortalized in literature, became the site of torture and murder as paramilitaries executed men and women and threw their bodies into the Drina River. Houses were set ablaze with families trapped inside. Survivors fled into forests with little more than the clothes on their backs, pursued by armed groups intent on erasing their existence. Even for those who escaped, no refuge was safe. Columns of civilians were ambushed and massacred as they attempted to reach UN-designated safe zones. The forests of eastern Bosnia became graveyards without markers. But ethnic cleansing was not carried out by Serb forces alone. Croat forces, too, engaged in campaigns to expel Bosniaks from regions they sought to incorporate into Croatia. In the Lazva Valley, Bosniak villages were attacked, civilians killed, and thousands displaced. Croat-run camps like Dritelj and Heliodrome imprisoned Bosniak civilians under brutal conditions. In central Bosnia, the conflict between Bosniaks and Croats created yet another layer of violence as former allies turned on each other, each seeking territorial control. Bosniak forces also committed crimes against Serb and Croat civilians, though on a smaller scale compared to the systematic operations carried out by Serb forces. Still, the brutality was not confined to one side. the war pulled ordinary people into its vortex of cruelty, and in the chaos of shifting alliances and revenge attacks, humanity became a scarce commodity. Ethnic cleansing operated not only through violence but through psychological warfare. Radio broadcasts urged people to betray neighbors. Flyers demanded evacuations within hours. Loudspeakers blared warnings that those who stayed would be killed. Trains and trucks arrived to deport entire communities to unknown destinations. Men were forced to sign documents relinquishing their homes before being expelled or killed. Propaganda fostered dehumanization, portraying entire ethnic groups as enemy forces rather than civilians. This process, combined with military force, created an atmosphere of terror so overwhelming that many fled before the violence reached them, leaving their homes, possessions, and ancestral lands behind. For many, the choice was between fleeing into uncertainty or staying and risking disappearance. In countless towns, the population shifted almost overnight. Streets once filled with children became deserted. Schools turned into military posts. Churches and mosques stood silent, damaged, or destroyed. Bosnia, once a mosaic, slowly transformed into a patchwork of ethnically homogenized zones. International peacekeepers and humanitarian workers witnessed the aftermath but lacked the authority or resources to intervene meaningfully. UN safe zones were declared but not defended. Srebrenica, Zepa, and Gorazde, areas designated to protect civilians, became overcrowded enclaves of desperation. UN convoys negotiated access with armed groups that often confiscated supplies. Peacekeepers were humiliated, taken hostage, used as human shields, or blocked from entering territories where massacres were unfolding. The world watched reports of mass atrocities, televised images of emaciated prisoners behind barbed wire, and footage of terrified civilians fleeing burning villages, but decisive intervention remained out of reach for years. Political debates in Washington, Brussels, and the United Nations stretched endlessly while the ethnic map of Bosnia was redrawn through violence. The human stories behind ethnic cleansing were heartbreaking beyond measure. Families torn apart at checkpoints never reunited. Mothers searched for sons whose names appeared on lists of missing persons. Survivors recounted being forced to watch executions of loved ones. Children witnessed acts of cruelty that no child should ever see. Homes passed down through generations were reduced to rubble. Cemeteries were desecrated. Livestock were slaughtered or abandoned. Entire cultural landscapes were destroyed, not merely buildings and fields, but the intangible heritage of a way of life where people of different backgrounds had lived together, celebrated together, mourned together. Ethnic cleansing was not only an assault on people but an assault on memory, identity, and the possibility of coexistence. As the war progressed, the scale of displacement became staggering. Over 2 million people, more than half the population of Bosnia, were forced from their homes. Refugees fled to Germany, Austria, Sweden, Turkey, the United States, Croatia, and Serbia. Many fled on foot, carrying children, pushing elderly relatives in wheelbarrows, walking through minefields, hiding in forests, and enduring starvation. Refugee camps across Europe became temporary homes for those who had once lived peaceful lives. Diaspora communities formed, held together by shared trauma. Survivors clung to photographs, documents, and memories of homes they might never see again. Ethnic cleansing was not merely a byproduct of war, it was the engine of the war, the strategy through which territory was claimed and power was enforced. It was systematic, brutal, and deliberate. And its consequences would reverberate for decades, long after the guns fell silent, long after peace agreements were signed, long after Bosnia began rebuilding its shattered cities and traumatized communities. The shadows of ethnic cleansing would linger in the form of thousands of missing persons, countless graves scattered across forests and farmlands, and survivors traumatized by memories they could not escape. The mosaic of Bosnia had been shattered, its pieces scattered across the world. And as the world would later learn, the darkest shadows of Europe had once again descended upon a land that had believed it could withstand the pull of history. The destruction of cities during the Bosnian War, and its wider Yugoslav collapse, was not merely the collateral damage of armed conflict but the deliberate unmaking of civilization itself, a systematic erasure of history, architecture, and culture designed to break the spirit of entire populations, and nowhere was this more evident than in the fates of Vukovar, Mostar, and countless towns that once thrived as centers of life, memory, and coexistence before they were transformed into landscapes of rubble, smoke, and sorrow. Vukovar, though technically located in Croatia and not Bosnia, became an early warning, a foreshadowing of what awaited the multi-ethnic towns of Bosnia, when in 1991 it fell under one of the most brutal sieges of the Yugoslav wars. A city known for its Baroque buildings, Danube riverfront, and vibrant mix of Serbs and Croats became a ghostly labyrinth of shattered walls and burning streets as Serbian forces and the Yugoslav People's Army encircled it for nearly 3 months. Daily shelling left neighborhoods unrecognizable, and hospitals overflowed with wounded civilians as electricity failed and supplies dwindled. Vukovar's fall in November 1991 was marked not by military triumph but by mass executions, the massacre of hundreds of patients and medical staff taken from the city's hospital, and the leveling of a city once admired for its beauty. This horrific event reverberated across the region, a grim template that demonstrated how urban centers, symbols of multiculturalism and shared identity, would become battlegrounds where humanity was stripped away brick by brick. Bosnia's urban heartlands felt these echoes long before the artillery arrived. Cities like Mostar, Prijda, Banja Luka, Bijeljina, and Sarajevo existed in the crosshairs of competing nationalist visions long before the first tanks rolled in or the first buildings caught fire. Mostar, the jewel of Herzegovina, stood as one of the most devastating examples of how a city soul could be shattered. Before the war, Mostar was famous for its stunning Emerald River, its Ottoman-era stone houses, and the legendary Stari Most Bridge, an architectural masterpiece built in the 16th century, spanning the Neretva River in a single elegant curve that symbolized the link between cultures, communities, and centuries. Mostar was a place where Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs lived side by side, where bazaars bustled with life, where the call to prayer harmonized with church bells, where tourists admired the ancient bridge while locals dove from its highest point into the icy river below. But when war reached Mostar in 1992, the city's beauty became a casualty of political ambition and ethnic hatred. Croat and Bosniak forces, once allies against Serbian expansion, turned against each other in a vicious struggle for control of Herzegovina. Streets that once echoed with laughter transformed into sniper corridors. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened carcasses of stone and ash. Artillery fire shook the city daily, collapsing roofs, igniting fires, and scattering debris across ancient courtyards. Food and medicine became scarce. Civilians fled from one ruined shelter to another, seeking refuge in basements as shells crashed overhead. The city's residents endured months of terror as armies turned their neighborhoods into battlegrounds. The destruction of Stari Most in November 1993 became one of the most symbolic acts of cultural annihilation in the entire conflict. Croatian forces targeted the bridge relentlessly for days, firing artillery until the ancient stones groaned under the impact, cracked, and finally collapsed into the Neretva River in a moment captured by cameras and broadcast around the world. The fall of the bridge felt like a dagger plunged into the heart of Bosnia. It was not merely a structure, it was a testament to coexistence, history, and shared identity. Its destruction was an act of cultural killing, a declaration that the past had no right to survive. Many Mostar residents wept as the stones fell, their grief amplified by the knowledge that this was not an accident of war but an intentional attempt to erase a symbol of unity. When Stari Most collapsed, it carried with it centuries of memory, pride, and connection. The river swallowed its stones, but the trauma of its fall became a global emblem of the war's brutality. Yet Mostar was only one of many cities torn apart by the conflict. The city of Prijda, once a thriving industrial center, became synonymous with ethnic cleansing as thousands of Bosniak and Croat residents were expelled, detained, or killed. Its streets, once lined with factories and apartment blocks, now echoed with the footsteps of soldiers enforcing curfews and searching homes. Schools were converted into detention centers. Playgrounds became graveyards. Banja Luka, the administrative center of Bosnian Serb forces, experienced a different kind of destruction, cultural genocide. Mosques, including the historic Ferhat Pasha Mosque, were blown up systematically to eliminate any trace of Bosniak presence. Bulldozers flattened ruins to ensure that nothing could be rebuilt. Churches and monasteries also suffered damage, collateral victims of a conflict that cared little for the sanctity of cultural heritage. In Bijeljina, paramilitary forces led by the infamous warlord Archon executed civilians in the streets, their bodies left as warnings to those who dared resist. Homes were ransacked, families terrorized, and entire districts emptied as gunmen patrolled openly. Photographs taken by foreign journalists showed scenes reminiscent of World War II, civilians lying dead on sidewalks, soldiers standing over them, smoke rising from burning homes. These images shocked the world but did little to stop the violence. Urban warfare in Bosnia was not like the industrial bombing campaigns of earlier wars. It was intimate, personal, and often carried out within neighborhoods where adversaries recognized each other by face. Snipers transformed apartment windows into killing positions. Mortars turned marketplaces into sites of mass death. Streets became frontlines, and frontlines shifted unpredictably as militias advanced house by house, floor by floor, room by room. The destruction of cities like Gorazde, Srebrenica, and Tuzla unfolded through a mixture of siege tactics, artillery barrages, and sudden assaults that left residents in a constant state of fear. The psychological damage was immense. People once known for hospitality now huddled in basements for months, emerging only briefly to search for food or check on neighbors. Generators hummed in darkened basements as families listened to distant explosions. Schools closed. Hospitals filled with the wounded. Cemeteries expanded. In cities like Tuzla, which struggled to maintain multi-ethnic unity, mortar attacks on civilian areas caused large-scale casualties, such as the horrifying massacre of young people in 1995 when a single shell killed dozens in a downtown square, a place where teenagers had gathered to celebrate life despite the war. The destruction of urban centers was accompanied by the destruction of cultural memory. Libraries burned, taking with them irreplaceable manuscripts and books. Museums were shelled. Archives, holding centuries of historical records, were lost in fires triggered by artillery strikes. The Oriental Institute in Sarajevo, home to rare Ottoman documents, went up in flames. The National Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina, housed in the iconic Vijećnica building, was targeted deliberately. As firefighters and volunteers formed human chains to save books while snipers fired at them, the sky above Sarajevo glowed orange with flames consuming thousands of volumes that chronicled the history of the region. It was an attack not only on knowledge but on identity, a message that Bosnia's past was being erased alongside its present. In the midst of this destruction, civilians struggled to preserve fragments of normal life. In Mostar, families cooked meals over makeshift stoves made from bricks scavenged from ruins. Children played in courtyards littered with shrapnel, their laughter mingling with distant explosions. Teachers held classes in basements, using chalkboards propped against cracked walls. In Sarajevo, residents created art, music, and poetry as acts of defiance, attempts to keep culture alive amid devastation. In Banja Luka, silent acts of resistance took the form of hidden artifacts buried in gardens or stored in secret rooms, protected from the soldiers who destroyed places of worship. In every city, the residents' will to survive formed a thread of hope woven through the darkest tapestry. The destruction of cities also fractured identities and altered demographics permanently. Neighborhoods that had once been ethnically integrated were carved into domains controlled by nationalist forces. Communities were uprooted. Survivors returned after the war to find their homes occupied by others or reduced to rubble. Streets bore new names, reflecting victory or loss. Many never returned, choosing instead to rebuild new lives abroad. The physical scars remained long after the war ended: bullet-riddled walls, shrapnel-pocked facades, abandoned high-rises, skeletal bridges, and memorials marking sites of massacres. The cities that emerged from the war were not the same cities that had entered it. They were haunted by ghosts, ghosts of the dead, ghosts of destroyed culture, ghosts of lost unity. Each street held memories of violence, each building a testament to endurance, each river a silent witness to suffering. Vukovar and Mostar, though separated by geography and ethnicity, became mirror tragedies, symbols of how war, fueled by nationalism and hatred, could reduce centuries-old cities to rubble and silence. Their stories echoed across Bosnia, warning that no place, no matter how beautiful or historically significant, was safe from the destructive forces unleashed by political ambition and ethnic division. And as the war continued to tear cities apart, the world watched, sometimes horrified, sometimes indifferent, often paralyzed, while urban landscapes that had once been vibrant and alive were turned into ash, dust, and ruins. The cities of Bosnia were not simply battlegrounds, they were victims, bearing wounds carved into their walls, their bridges, their streets, and the collective memory of the people who once called them home. The network of prison camps that emerged across Bosnia during the war represented one of the darkest and most systematically brutal dimensions of the conflict, a machinery of terror constructed not only to remove, torture, and annihilate targeted populations but to break their will, erase their identity, and send a message of dominion that reverberated far beyond the barbed wire fences enclosing thousands of terrified men, women, and children, and while the world would eventually come to know. Names like Omarska, Keraterm, Trinopolia, Dritelj, Heliodrome, Celebisai, Manjica, Uzamnica, and countless others. During the early months of the war, these camps flourished in the shadows, concealed behind propaganda, lies, and the silence of those too afraid to speak, allowing atrocities to multiply unchecked in towns and villages across the devastated landscape of Bosnia. The emergence of these camps was not spontaneous, nor were they crude improvisations of chaotic militias. Many were deliberately established as instruments of ethnic cleansing, designed to process civilians like cattle, separating them into categories: those to be killed, those to be tortured, those to be expelled, and those to be exploited as labor or bargaining chips in prisoner exchanges. For survivors who passed through these places, the memory of them would never fade. They became nightmares carved into bone, memories that returned with every sound resembling a guard shout, every cold floor that recalled the concrete blocks where they slept, every closed room that reminded them of suffocation, darkness, fear. Omarska, perhaps the most infamous of all, stood as a hell no novelist could have invented, a place where the line between man and beast was erased by deliberate cruelty. Located near the town of Prijda, it was officially presented by Bosnian Serb authorities as a detention center, but inside its rusted red walls, behind its iron gates, lay a world of systematic torture. Prisoners were crammed into rooms so tightly packed that they could barely move. They slept on concrete floors covered in blood, sweat, and excrement. Guards beat them daily, sometimes to extract information, sometimes out of sadism, sometimes simply because violence had become the only language spoken inside the camp. Men were forced to stand for hours, days even, without rest. Others were lined against walls and beaten with rifle butts, metal pipes, or wooden planks until they collapsed. Food was scarce, watery soup served in rusted barrels from which prisoners drank like animals. Water was contaminated. Disease spread rapidly: dysentery, fever, infections, but the sick received no care. Interrogations were torture sessions. Prisoners were forced to watch executions, to witness the deaths of friends or family members, to listen to the screams of those being brutalized in adjacent rooms. The psychological torment was often worse than the physical. Survivors of Omarska described how the camp became a space where humanity dissolved, men once proud, educated, successful, reduced to skeletal figures who pleaded for mercy or wept openly, something none would have imagined doing before the war. Some were forced to beat other prisoners under orders, a cruelty designed to fracture solidarity. Others were used in staged propaganda photos to hide the reality of atrocities from the world. Keraterm, located in a former ceramic factory, was no less horrifying. Prisoners were held in what had once been production rooms, now filled with the stench of unwashed bodies, blood, and fear. One of the rooms, infamously known as Room 3, became a slaughterhouse where guards carried out mass executions with automatic weapons. Survivors recounted nights when gunshots echoed continuously, when trucks arrived to load bodies, when moans of the dying floated across the concrete floors. At Keraterm, humiliation was weaponized. Prisoners were forced to strip, dance, or crawl on the ground as guards laughed, mocked, and beat them. Many were tortured with electric shocks or subjected to physical mutilation. The camp was designed not only to kill but to destroy dignity, to reduce prisoners to objects of degradation. Trinopolia, often falsely portrayed by perpetrators as a refugee center, was in fact an ethnic cleansing facility where thousands of Bosniak civilians, men, women, and children were processed before being deported, expelled, or killed. Journalists captured iconic images of emaciated prisoners behind barbed wire at Trinopolia, images that shocked the world and echoed memories of Nazi concentration camps from half a century earlier. The sight of gaunt men with hollowed eyes staring through fences pierced the global conscience, forcing international media to acknowledge that Europe, once again, hosted industrial-scale cruelty. Yet even in the face of this evidence, political leaders hesitated, debated, looked away. Meanwhile, inside the camps, women were separated and taken to locations where they faced sexual violence that left physical and emotional scars impossible to erase. Sexual violence was not incidental to the camps, it was a core tactic of war, a method of ethnic terror. Women and girls, some as young as 12 or 13, were repeatedly raped by soldiers and paramilitaries, often in front of family members. Rape was used to forcibly impregnate, to shame, to traumatize, and to fracture the social fabric of communities. Many women remained silent for decades after the war, carrying their wounds in isolation because of cultural stigma, shame, or fear of being disbelieved. Bosnia became a landscape of invisible trauma, where survivors walked among ruins carrying unspeakable memories. Croat-run camps in Herzegovina, Dritelj, Heliodrome, Gabela, operated with similar brutality, in some cases using underground cells, starvation, forced labor, and torture to break detainees. Bosniak forces also maintained detention centers where Serb civilians were abused, though the scale and organization were far smaller. But the tragedy remained, no group emerged untainted. War had unleashed barbarism across all lines, turning civilians into prisoners, families into targets, homes into crime scenes. The logic of ethnic cleansing demanded places where the unwanted could be concentrated, tortured, killed, or expelled. The camps served this purpose with horrifying efficiency. Celebici camp, run by Bosniak and Croat forces in the Konjic region, revealed another layer of the war's complexity when investigators uncovered evidence of beatings, torture, sexual assault, and killings. At Manjica, thousands of Bosniak and Croat detainees endured beatings so severe that bones snapped under the weight of rifle strikes. At Batkovic, prisoners were forced to work in fields or dig trenches under constant threat of execution. Each camp, regardless of who controlled it, represented a collapse of human morality under the pressures of fear, revenge, and political manipulation. The war turned neighbors into captors, civilians into prisoners, and entire ethnic groups into targets for annihilation or expulsion. The existence of these camps was not hidden to everyone. International observers, journalists, and humanitarian workers caught glimpses, photos smuggled out, testimonies whispered, movements tracked. But bureaucracy, political caution, and geopolitical hesitation allowed many camps to operate for months before any meaningful action occurred. UN forces had limited mandates, unable to storm camps or disrupt military operations. Reporters who uncovered evidence risked their lives, facing threats from armed groups desperate to conceal their crimes. The world watched, horrified yet paralyzed, as news broadcast images of skeletal prisoners reminiscent of Holocaust survivors. The phrase "never again," so often invoked after World War II, rang painfully hollow. Inside the camps, time lost meaning. Days became a blur of hunger, fear, pain, and uncertainty. Prisoners survived by forming secret alliances, sharing scraps of food, whispering stories of hope, recalling families they prayed were still alive. Some recited poetry or sang quietly to preserve a trace of humanity. Others withdrew completely into silence, mentally escaping the nightmare. In Omarskar, prisoners in the White House, a room infamous for torture, learned to measure time by the screams they heard from adjacent rooms. In Karaturm, prisoners waited for nightfall with dread, knowing the darkness often brought executions. In Trinopolia, mothers shielded their children as best they could, whispering assurances they did not believe. Many never emerged from these camps. Those who did often carried lifelong injuries, broken ribs that never healed properly, damaged kidneys from repeated kicks, chronic pain from beatings. Others carried invisible wounds, nightmares, depression, flashbacks, survivors' guilt. The war ended, but the camps continued to exist in the memories of survivors, haunting them long after the barbed wire was removed and their captors walked free or were brought before international tribunals. The discovery of mass graves after the war further revealed the extent of the camp's horrors. Bulldozed pits filled with bodies were unearthed in forests, riverbanks, and abandoned mines. Forensic teams worked meticulously to identify remains, matching bones to missing persons reports, returning fragments of loved ones to grieving families. Each exhumation was a painful chapter in Bosnia's reckoning with its past, a reminder that beneath the green landscapes and rebuilt towns lay a substratum of death. The camps were not merely places of imprisonment, they were engines of genocide. The perpetrators knew that killing a population required more than bullets, it required the destruction of identity, spirit, and community. The camps aimed to achieve precisely that. They stand in history as dark monuments to human cruelty, symbols of how war can degrade civilization to its most barbaric form. And yet, the survival of thousands who endured these camps stands as a testament to resilience, a refusal to be broken entirely. Survivors carried their stories into courtrooms, memorials, books, documentaries, and quiet testimonies given decades later. Their voices became the evidence upon which the world judged the crimes of the war. Their endurance ensured that the truth would not remain hidden, that the horrors of Bosnia's prison camps would be known, remembered, and understood as warnings for future generations. The hidden horrors of Bosnia's prison camps were not simply episodes of a distant war, they were windows into the darkest corners of human behavior, reminders that evil thrives when power goes unchecked, when propaganda replaces truth, when silence shields perpetrators. They were the darkest shadows cast over a land already drowning in violence. And as Bosnia continued its descent into chaos, the camps became part of a larger tapestry of suffering that would culminate in even greater tragedies, events that would shock the world, force intervention, and leave scars that continue to shape the region's identity to this day. The arrival of the United Nations in Bosnia, symbolized by the familiar blue helmets and armored vehicles bearing the white UN insignia, was greeted by civilians with a mixture of desperate hope, confusion, and soon, deep disappointment, for while the international community proclaimed its intention to uphold peace, protect civilians, and maintain humanitarian corridors, the reality on the ground proved far more complex, constrained, and tragic than anyone in Bosnia or abroad initially. Understood, the UN arrived not as a decisive force capable of stopping the war but as a limited, bureaucratically strangled mission tasked with managing catastrophe rather than preventing it, a mission defined by its noble intentions and its crippling restrictions, its brave peacekeepers and its impotence under fire, its simultaneous role as witness and bystander to one of the most devastating conflicts in modern Europe. As early as 1992, when reports of widespread ethnic cleansing, mass displacement, and urban sieges reached the international community, pressure mounted for intervention. Yet the global powers, still adjusting to the post-Cold War world, approached Bosnia with caution and political hesitation. The United Nations Protection Force, UNPROFOR, originally deployed to Croatia, was extended into Bosnia in a mission whose mandate was fundamentally flawed. It was sent into an active war zone not to enforce peace but to observe it, to negotiate ceasefires that were violated almost immediately upon signing, to escort humanitarian convoys that were frequently blocked, looted, or shelled, and to protect safe areas that were neither safe nor truly protected. The UN entered Bosnia unarmed in purpose but heavily armed in symbolism, a contradiction that would soon reveal the limits of international resolve and the cost of diplomatic caution. The peacekeepers themselves came from dozens of countries: Ireland, Canada, France, Britain, Ukraine, Sweden, the Netherlands, Jordan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and many others, men who had trained for peacekeeping missions, not for the brutality of ethnic war. They arrived in white-painted armored personnel carriers, rolling into cities like Sarajevo, Tuzla, Bihać, and Srebrenica, their presence greeted by weary civilians who believed, or wanted to believe, that the worst might soon end. In the early days, children waved at the convoys, touching the cold metal of the UN vehicles as though it were a talisman of protection. Families brought food to soldiers. Residents begged peacekeepers to intervene, to stop the shelling, to confront the militias terrorizing their neighborhoods. But the soldiers were restricted by strict rules of engagement that allowed them to fire only in self-defense. They could not disarm militias. They could not take sides. They could not prevent attacks on civilians. They could not dismantle checkpoints. They could not protect entire cities. Their job, as defined by diplomats far away, was to maintain neutrality in a conflict where neutrality often meant allowing atrocities to unfold unchecked. Nowhere was the UN's paradox more painfully visible than in Sarajevo, where peacekeepers patrolled streets under sniper fire yet lacked the authority to neutralize the gunmen targeting civilians. UN convoys delivered humanitarian aid, flour, rice, powdered milk, medical supplies, but these convoys were often delayed by days, even weeks, at checkpoints controlled by armed groups who demanded bribes, confiscated food, or simply used the delays as leverage in political negotiations. UN vehicles, intended as symbols of neutrality, became targets for militias who viewed them as obstacles or bargaining chips. Peacekeepers were shot at, kidnapped, used as human shields, and humiliated by paramilitary forces who understood the UN's limitations and exploited them mercilessly. At times, UN soldiers felt trapped between their orders and their moral instincts. They witnessed civilians being beaten or threatened at checkpoints but were forbidden to intervene. They saw snipers firing on children yet could not return fire unless directly targeted. They lived in bunkers and fortified compounds, hearing the screams of nearby neighborhoods, unable to stop the violence unfolding just beyond their perimeter. The concept of safe areas, introduced by the UN in 1993, became one of the most tragic illusions of the war. 6 towns, Srebrenica, Zepa, Gorazde, Tuzla, Bihać, and Sarajevo, were declared safe under UN protection, theoretically shielded from attack by warring forces. But the designation was a diplomatic gesture rather than a military guarantee. The safe areas were overcrowded with tens of thousands of displaced civilians who believed that the blue flag flying above UN bases offered them some measure of safety. In reality, the peacekeepers stationed in these enclaves were too few, too lightly armed, and too constrained by their mandates to defend the civilian populations. In Srebrenica, for example, approximately 400 lightly armed Dutch soldiers were responsible for protecting a town surrounded by thousands of heavily armed Bosnian Serb troops. They lacked food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Requests for air support were delayed, denied, or lost in bureaucratic chains of command. When Bosnian Serb General Ratko Mladic entered Srebrenica in July 1995, shaking hands with UN officers while his forces gathered defenseless men and boys to be executed, the world witnessed the catastrophic failure of the international community's promise. Yet even before the devastating fall of Srebrenica, signs of the UN's inability to maintain peace were visible across Bosnia. In Gorazde, civilians fled into forests as artillery rained down on the town, while UN observers called desperately for NATO airstrikes that were slow to materialize. In Bihać, surrounded on all sides and suffering from starvation and disease, UN convoys often could not reach the enclave due to militia blockages. In Tuzla, although relatively safe compared to other regions, peacekeepers struggled to manage the influx of refugees fleeing massacres in nearby towns. The UN mission, conceived as a humanitarian operation, became overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crisis. Peacekeepers worked tirelessly under impossible circumstances, building makeshift roads, repairing bridges, and escorting civilians through dangerous zones. Many soldiers forged bonds with locals, learning their stories, sharing their grief, and doing what little their mandates allowed to ease suffering. But they were also forced to witness horrors they were powerless to prevent. Some returned home with deep psychological trauma, haunted by memories of atrocities they could not stop. The UN, at the diplomatic level, struggled to maintain credibility as negotiations repeatedly failed and ceasefires collapsed. International leaders convened in conference rooms in Geneva, New York, Brussels, and London, attempting to impose peace plans that rarely reflected the realities on the ground. Maps were drawn and redrawn, dividing Bosnia into cantons, entities, or zones, but each proposal sparked outrage among one faction or another. The Van Zoen Peace Plan, the Owen-Stoltenberg Plan, the Contact Group Plan, each fell apart in the face of political mistrust and continued violence. Meanwhile, civilians suffered. For them, the war was not a matter of shifting borders or geopolitical calculations but a daily battle to find food, avoid shells, bury the dead, and protect their families. The peacekeepers often found themselves caught in the crossfire, both literally and metaphorically. They were shot at by all sides. Serb forces accused them of supporting Bosniaks. Bosniaks accused them of collaborating with Serbs. Croats viewed them as obstacles. Militias used UN soldiers as bargaining tools, taking them hostage whenever NATO airstrikes were threatened. In May 1995, Bosnian Serb forces captured nearly 400 UN personnel, chaining them to potential bombing targets as human shields to deter NATO from conducting airstrikes. These shocking scenes underscored the vulnerability of international forces and the audacity of those who sought to manipulate them. Many peacekeepers felt anger, shame, and helplessness at being reduced to tools in a brutal conflict they were sent to prevent. Despite their limitations, many UN soldiers displayed extraordinary bravery. They risked sniper fire to escort civilians. They negotiated releases of detainees. They secured small humanitarian corridors that saved lives. They defended UN compounds under attack. Their actions, limited though they were, formed lifelines for communities that would otherwise have faced complete annihilation. Individual acts of courage, soldiers sharing their own rations with starving civilians, medics treating wounded children under fire, convoy drivers navigating mined roads, became the invisible threads holding together a semblance of hope. But courage at the ground level could not compensate for strategic failure at the top. The UN's mandate was fundamentally mismatched to the reality of the Bosnian War. Peacekeeping assumes the existence of peace. In Bosnia, there was none. Peacekeeping assumes cooperation from warring parties. In Bosnia, militias saw the UN as either an annoyance or a shield for their own atrocities. Peacekeeping assumes neutrality can protect civilians. In Bosnia, neutrality often meant standing aside while one side committed massacres. The UN mission became a symbol of global indecision, a warning of what happens when diplomacy replaces decisive action in the face of genocide. By 1994 and 1995, as the world watched television images of burning cities, starving refugees, and grieving families, the pressure on NATO and major world powers increased. UN generals on the ground sent urgent pleas to headquarters, insisting that safe areas could not be protected without air support and a stronger mandate. The UN Security Council debated endlessly. Nations weighed political consequences. But as debates continued, people died. The war raged on. Sarajevo endured its relentless siege. Massacres continued in villages. Camps operated in secrecy. And safe areas teetered on the edge of collapse. The UN's role in Bosnia became the subject of fierce debate that continues to this day. Was it a heroic effort undermined by political constraints, or a catastrophic failure that enabled genocide? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere between. UN peacekeepers did save lives. They delivered millions of tons of humanitarian aid. They maintained some semblance of international presence that prevented Bosnia from descending into absolute isolation. But their inability to stop the worst atrocities, especially Srebrenica, left a permanent scar on the institution's credibility. The blue helmets, symbols of hope, became symbols of helplessness. In the final analysis, the UN in Bosnia represented a tragic paradox. It was both essential and ineffective, both courageous and constrained, both a lifeline and a reminder of the world's reluctance to confront evil with force. The mission failed not because the soldiers lacked bravery but because the world lacked unity, will, and moral clarity. Bosnia needed protectors, but it received monitors. Bosnia needed intervention, but it received negotiations. Bosnia needed justice, but it received bureaucracy. And so the blue helmets, men who had arrived to keep peace, became unwilling witnesses to genocide. Their story is a chapter in the Bosnian War that reveals the limits of international diplomacy, the consequences of political hesitation, and the heartbreaking cost of failing to protect the vulnerable. It is a reminder that peace cannot be kept where peace has already been shattered, and that neutrality in the face of brutality is not peacekeeping, it is abandonment. The fall of Srebrenica in July 1995 was not merely a military defeat, nor simply another episode in a brutal war. It was the culmination of years of hatred, fear, manipulation, and abandonment, the moment when Europe, despite its vows of never again, failed to prevent the first genocide on its soil since the Holocaust, a moment when the entire international system, diplomats, peacekeepers, global powers, and institutions collapsed under the weight of their own caution and indecision, leaving more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys to be hunted, executed, and buried in mass graves across the forests and fields of eastern Bosnia, and to fully grasp the enormity of this tragedy, one must begin with the desperation, hunger, terror, and fragile hope that became daily reality for the tens of thousands of civilians trapped in the Srebrenica enclave long before the final assault began. Srebrenica, declared a UN-safe area in 1993, had become a swollen refuge for Bosniak civilians fleeing waves of ethnic cleansing sweeping the Drina Valley. Villages such as Konjević Polje, Srpska, Bratunag, and Zepa emptied as families marched through forests carrying infants, dragging elderly relatives, and praying they would not run into armed units along the way. By 1995, the enclave was overflowing with more than 40,000 starving civilians crammed into makeshift shelters, schools, gymnasiums, basements, and tents stitched together from torp and plastic sheeting. Food deliveries from the UN were sporadic. Serb forces frequently blocked convoys, confiscated supplies, or forced aid workers to wait for weeks at checkpoints. Children in Srebrenica grew gaunt, their ribs visible beneath thin shirts. People boiled grass and roots for sustenance. Hundreds died from malnutrition or treatable diseases as the enclave grew increasingly isolated. The Dutch peacekeepers stationed in Srebrenica, Dutchbat, were underfed, underarmed, isolated, and powerless to challenge the surrounding Bosnian Serb army commanded by General Ratko Mladic, who viewed Srebrenica not merely as a military target but as a symbol of defiance that needed to be crushed. In the months leading up to the fall, Serb forces tightened their grip. They captured outlying observation posts held by Dutchbat soldiers, seized their weapons, and cut off escape routes. Despite repeated pleas from Bosnian government officials and UN commanders on the ground for reinforcements, ammunition, and air support, the UN bureaucracy stalled. Requests for NATO airstrikes were delayed by layers of approval processes in Sarajevo, Zagreb, New York, and Brussels, each layer fearful of provoking retaliation against peacekeepers or escalating the conflict. While diplomats debated, Serb artillery pounded the enclave. Civilians ran for shelter in muddy trenches and school basements. Mothers clutched children as shells exploded overhead. Dutch soldiers watched helplessly, forbidden from firing unless directly attacked. The fear in Srebrenica grew unbearable. Survivors later described the sense of suffocation that settled over the town, the knowledge that they were surrounded, abandoned, and at the mercy of an enemy who had long promised to take revenge on the Bosniaks of eastern Bosnia. Mladic had vowed repeatedly that Srebrenica would fall. In July 1995, he made good on that promise. The Serb offensive began with overwhelming force. Tanks, infantry, and artillery advanced on the enclave, pushing back Bosniak defenders who were low on ammunition, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered. As the front lines collapsed, thousands of civilians rushed toward the UN base at Potokari, a small factory compound where Dutchbat had established its headquarters. The roads leading to the base became scenes of chaos. Women carrying children ran barefoot across scorching pavement, elderly men limped along with makeshift crutches, families held hands, terrified of becoming separated, livestock wandered through the crowds, people fainted from heat and hunger as shells exploded in the distance. By the evening of July 11, more than 20,000 civilians were crammed around the gates of Potokari, pleading with Dutch soldiers to let them inside. But the base could hold only a few thousand. The majority were forced to remain outside, exposed to the encroaching Serb forces. Dutch soldiers, overwhelmed and emotionally shattered, struggled to maintain order. Shots rang out as panic spread through the crowd. Babies cried. Mothers screamed the names of lost children. Older men knelt on the ground, praying quietly, their faces pale with dread. When Ratko Mladic entered Potokari accompanied by cameras and soldiers, he performed for the world the role he had carefully crafted, a commanding general offering mercy while delivering terror. He patted children on the head, handed out chocolates, and spoke of evacuation for everyone's safety. But even as he posed as a benevolent figure, his soldiers surrounded the camp, separating the men and boys from the rest of the population. Buses and trucks arrived, some painted white to resemble humanitarian vehicles. Women, children, and elderly men were forced onto them, told they were being sent to Bosniak-held territory. Many cried, unsure if they would ever see their loved ones again. But the men, those aged roughly between 12 and 65, were taken aside, beaten, bound, or lined up at gunpoint. Some were loaded into trucks. Others were forced into warehouses, schools, or abandoned houses. Dutch soldiers pleaded for intervention, begged for airstrikes, attempted to negotiate the release of civilians, but their calls went unanswered or were denied. Hours after Srebrenica fell, the machinery of genocide began. While thousands gathered in Potokari, more than 15,000 Bosniak men, civilians and some soldiers, attempted the impossible, a breakout through the forests toward Tuzla, 50 kilometers away. They formed a column stretching miles long, moving in near silence through dense woods, ravines, and minefields under constant threat of ambush. The march, later known as the Death March, became one of the most harrowing episodes of the entire war. Serb forces shelled the column repeatedly, causing chaos as explosions ripped through tightly packed groups, sending bodies flying, scattering survivors in all directions. Machine guns sprayed the woods. Men screamed, fell, and vanished into the undergrowth. Survivors recounted scenes of absolute terror, streams choked with corpses, trees splintered by shrapnel, men drinking from muddy puddles, hallucinating from exhaustion, crying for water. Many were tricked into surrendering by Serb soldiers wearing stolen Dutch uniforms or using loudspeakers to call out promises of safety. Those who surrendered were executed. Thousands were captured during ambushes or hunted down by dogs and paramilitary units. Others committed suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. Only a fraction of the column ultimately reached safety. Back in Potokari, the separation of the men was followed by mass executions. Some were killed immediately, shot in the back of the head behind warehouses, dumped in shallow pits. Others were transported to killing sites across the region, farm fields, riverbanks, school gyms, football fields, warehouses, and remote clearings. At the Branjevo military farm, lines of blindfolded men were forced off trucks, their hands tied behind their backs, told to kneel or stand against walls. Executioners, often intoxicated or smiling in photographs later uncovered, fired into the backs of their heads or sprayed them with automatic weapons. The bodies were then bulldozed into mass graves. Bulldozers sometimes buried the wounded alive. At the Kravica warehouse, thousands were crammed into a large metal building before grenades were thrown in and gunfire followed. Survivors who played dead described lying beneath piles of bodies, struggling to breathe, feeling warm blood pooling beneath them, hearing footsteps of soldiers moving through the dark building shooting anyone who moaned or moved. In the days and weeks that followed, Serb forces used excavators to dig up primary mass graves and rebury bodies in smaller, hidden graves across the countryside in an attempt to conceal the scale of the genocide. This gruesome reburial process left body parts scattered across multiple locations, complicating later forensic identification efforts. Families searching for missing fathers, sons, and brothers would spend decades awaiting the discovery and identification of remains, sometimes only a few bones, sometimes a skull, sometimes fragments from multiple graves reassembled painstakingly by forensic experts. When the world finally saw images from Srebrenica, emaciated refugees reaching Tuzla, grieving women collapsing on dusty roads, Dutch soldiers returning home in shame, satellite photos revealing disturbed earth where graves lay hidden, the outrage came too late. Politicians condemned the massacre, journalists covered the tragedy, diplomats expressed shock and horror. But none of it changed the fact that more than 8,000 lives had been extinguished in a matter of days. The genocide at Srebrenica shattered any remaining illusion that the international community could remain neutral in Bosnia. It forced NATO and world powers to acknowledge that the war had crossed every moral and legal boundary. It led to intensified airstrikes against Bosnian Serb positions and ultimately pushed all warring parties toward the Dayton Peace Accords. But for the families of Srebrenica, no political settlement could undo what had been done. The legacy of Srebrenica is carried in the sobs of mothers who still visit the rows of white grave markers each July at the Potokari Memorial Cemetery, placing flowers on the graves of sons who died as teenagers, husbands who never returned, brothers whose bodies were found decades later in secondary mass graves. It is carried in the haunted eyes of survivors of the Death March, men who still wake in the night drenched in sweat, hearing the echoes of gunfire in the forest. It is carried in courtrooms where survivors testified bravely against their tormentors, ensuring the truth was documented for history. It is carried in the etched names of thousands on memorial walls, the silence of abandoned villages, the stories told to grandchildren who did not live through the war but still live with its shadow. Srebrenica was not merely a failure, it was a catastrophe that revealed the consequences of political hesitation, the cost of divided international will, and the fragility of human life when hatred is armed and unchecked. It stands as the darkest day of the Bosnian War, the moment when the world's promises of protection proved hollow, and when an entire population was betrayed by those meant to safeguard them. It remains a wound that has not healed, a reminder written in mass graves and memories that genocide can occur even in an age of satellite imagery, global media, and international law. And as Bosnia continued its descent toward the war's end in 1995, the shadow of Srebrenica loomed over every negotiation, every military action, and every attempt to rebuild, forever staining the conscience of Europe with the knowledge that, once again, humanity had failed the innocent. Long before the major powers found the political courage to intervene decisively in Bosnia, it was the journalists, photographers, war correspondents, and courageous local civilians with handheld cameras who dragged the world, often unwillingly, into the intimate horrors of a war many preferred to dismiss as a complex ethnic conflict, and Section 9 begins not with governments but with lenses, cameras that captured the mangled bodies of civilians in Sarajevo's marketplaces, the skeletal shadows of prisoners behind barbed wire in camps like Trinopolia, the mothers weeping over freshly dug graves, the burnt-out shells of mosques, churches, and homes, the desperate faces of refugees trudging through snow or forests as they fled massacres, and the defiant survivors who continued to live, love, create, and endure despite the darkness swallowing their world. For while diplomats debated and foreign leaders feigned confusion over the ancient hatreds they claimed to see in Bosnia, the global media refused to let these distortions stand unchallenged, gradually turning the world's attention toward a war that could no longer be ignored, shamed out of the shadows by images too vivid, too damning, too human to be dismissed. From the earliest days of the conflict, reporters risked their lives to document the unfolding catastrophe. Sarajevo became one of the most dangerous assignments in the world, yet journalists continued to sneak into the city by perilous routes over Mount Igman, carrying equipment through minefields, shells exploding nearby, sniper alley stretching ahead like a gauntlet of death. Some were killed, David Kaplan, Paul Jenks, and others, fallen witnesses whose legacy survives in the footage they captured. Yet for every casualty, more arrived, drawn by a sense of duty, outrage, or the belief that the world needed to understand that this was not a Balkan quarrel but a human tragedy shocking in scale, cruelty, and moral clarity. The media played a crucial role in stripping away the comfortable narratives foreign governments attempted to build around the war. Early in the conflict, distant political leaders hid behind the rhetoric of even-handedness, claiming that all sides were equally responsible for the violence. But the images told a different truth: columns of Bosniak refugees trudging through snow, their homes burning behind them, children crying beside bodies torn apart by mortars, rows of gaunt prisoners behind fences resembling those of World War II concentration camps, skeletal survivors describing torture in hushed, trembling voices. In 1992, ITN journalists Penny Marshall and Ian Williams broadcast footage from camps in northern Bosnia showing emaciated men behind barbed wire, images that stunned the world and triggered immediate comparisons to the Holocaust. The reactions were visceral. People who had never heard of Prajda or Omarskar suddenly understood that something monstrous was happening in Europe. Politicians scrambled to respond, not out of moral clarity but because their constituents demanded answers. Newspapers ran front-page headlines calling for intervention. Television anchors expressed shock and outrage. Editorials condemned the civilized world for standing idle while genocide unfolded in real time. Sarajevo, under siege, became the most filmed, photographed, and reported war zone of the decade. Images of Sarajevo's daily tragedies circulated globally: a woman in a bright red coat running across a sniper-infested intersection, her arms clutched around bread loaves, a man carrying his injured child through debris-strewn streets, face twisted in agony, elderly residents filling water containers at outdoor spigots as shells exploded in the distance, funerals taking place under sniper fire, mourners ducking behind gravestones as shots rang out, lovers holding hands as they crossed dangerous streets, refusing to let the war steal their humanity. The Sarajevo Romeo and Juliet, Bosko Brkic, a Serb, and Admira Ismik, a Bosniak, became one of the most haunting symbols of the siege. The young couple was shot dead by snipers while attempting to flee the city, their bodies lying in an embrace on the Vabanja Bridge for days because no one dared retrieve them. Photographers captured their stillness, the tragic finality of lives undone by hatred they refused to embrace. Their story spread worldwide, a heartbreaking reminder that the people of Bosnia were not ancient enemies but victims of political manipulation. As the war dragged on, global media coverage intensified, exposing atrocities that governments preferred to ignore. In 1992 and 1993, journalists traveled across Bosnia documenting burned villages, destroyed mosques, mass graves being hastily filled, and refugees crowding into makeshift camps. In Mostar, reporters filmed the shelling of Stari Most, the centuries-old Ottoman bridge, its graceful arch collapsing into the Neretva River in a plume of smoke and dust. The footage shocked Europe, showing that the war targeted not only lives but culture, identity, memory. In 1995, cameras captured the aftermath of the Markale marketplace massacres in Sarajevo, blood-soaked vegetables scattered across shattered pavement, torn body parts lying beside overturned market stalls, survivors screaming in horror, firefighters hosing down blood as more shells fell. The images from Markale, broadcast repeatedly across global networks, shattered the illusion that negotiation could end the war. The world saw civilians massacred in a place that should have been safe, peaceful, ordinary. The media also exposed the failures of the international community. Cameras captured UN peacekeepers sitting helplessly as civilians were loaded onto buses by armed militias. Footage of crying Dutch soldiers outside Srebrenica, overwhelmed by shame and guilt, raised global outrage. Images of peacekeepers chained to telephone poles by Serb forces as human shields humiliated the United Nations and galvanized NATO to push for stronger mandates. Interviews with refugees revealed the despair of families who felt utterly abandoned by the world. In Tuzla, journalists filmed grieving mothers throwing themselves onto the bodies of sons killed in the Kapija massacre, their cries echoing through television screens into living rooms across Europe and America. These images made it impossible for political leaders to continue claiming ignorance or urging patience. The global camera did more than inform, it humanized. It captured not only suffering but resistance, courage, and endurance. Footage from Sarajevo's underground cultural scene showed theater performances by candlelight, art exhibitions in basements, rock concerts in bomb shelters, and the Defiant Miss besieged Sarajevo beauty pageant where young women held a sign reading "Don't let them kill us." These scenes, broadcast around the world, defied the narrative that Bosnia was doomed by ethnic hatred. They showed a population determined to live, laugh, create, and dream even in the darkest of circumstances. They gave the world a reason to care. Still, media coverage was met with cynicism in some quarters. Critics argued that journalists sensationalized suffering or failed to present both sides. Some politicians dismissed reports as exaggerated or manipulated. But as evidence mounted, photographs of mass graves, testimonies of survivors, satellite imagery of disturbed Earth, denial became impossible. The camera had caught too many truths. Investigators later used footage shot by journalists as evidence in war crimes trials. Photos of paramilitaries posing with victims became incriminating artifacts. Videos of soldiers escorting bound prisoners into warehouses later used as execution sites helped build cases against perpetrators. The media did not merely record history, in many ways, it helped prosecute it. For the Bosnian diaspora, those who fled to Germany, Austria, Sweden, Turkey, the United States, the global coverage was both a lifeline and a torment. They watched their homeland burn from afar, saw familiar streets turned into graveyards, witnessed neighbors they had grown up with lying dead in images broadcast on nightly news. Mothers saw pictures of skeletal prisoners and thought they recognized their sons. Fathers saw footage of refugee lines and searched for glimpses of daughters or wives. Families called international hotlines, aid agencies, and government offices, desperate for information about missing loved ones. In refugee camps, televisions became sacred objects, windows to a world that was watching even if it was not yet acting. Gradually, public opinion shifted. Citizens wrote letters to their governments demanding intervention. Activists organized protests in major cities, London, Paris, New York, Stockholm, holding signs with names of massacres, Prijda, Armisi, Foka, Visegrad. Holocaust survivors spoke out, saying they recognized the signs of genocide. Human rights groups released scathing reports citing specific perpetrators. The pressure built until political leaders could no longer pretend that neutrality was moral or sustainable. It was the camera, more than any speech or diplomatic cable, that eroded the excuses for inaction. When the world saw blood on cobblestones, mothers searching mass graves with trembling hands, and gaunt prisoners pleading silently through barbed wire, the moral distance collapsed. Bosnia was no longer an abstract conflict. It was human, immediate, unbearable. And as the images grew more devastating, culminating in the footage of refugees fleeing Srebrenica, the world finally confronted its failure. NATO airstrikes intensified. Diplomacy hardened. The war entered its final, decisive phase. In the end, Section 9 is the story of how Bosnia forced itself into the world's conscience through cameras that refused to look away, journalists who risked their lives to expose atrocities, survivors who spoke even when their voices shook, and images that burned themselves into history. The global camera turned, and the world could no longer pretend it did not see. Operation Deliberate Force, launched in late August 1995, was not simply a NATO bombing campaign. It was the moment the world finally found the will, the unity, and the moral clarity to act decisively after years of hesitation, paralysis, failed diplomacy, and unbearable civilian suffering. It was the moment when the long, blood-soaked arc of the Bosnian War bent sharply toward its conclusion, when the balance of power shifted irreversibly away from those who had laid siege to cities, filled mass graves, burned villages, and driven millions from their homes. And yet, to understand why this operation mattered so profoundly, one must first retrace the years of agony that preceded it, years when NATO aircraft patrolled the skies but rarely fired, when the international community debated endlessly while artillery shells fell on Sarajevo's marketplaces, when the world watched the genocide at Srebrenica unfold in slow motion, and when every timid ceasefire collapsed before the ink dried. For Bosnia's civilians, the war had become an unending cycle of broken promises and escalating horrors, and by the summer of 1995, the desperation reached a point where even the faintest sign of decisive action felt like a lifeline pulled from the heavens. The turning point came with blood. On August 28, 1995, a mortar shell fired by Bosnian Serb forces exploded in Sarajevo's Markale marketplace, killing 43 civilians and wounding more than 80 others. It was the second massacre at Markale in 2 years, and the images of mangled bodies, blood splattered across vegetables and fruit stalls, and screaming survivors filled television screens worldwide. The world had seen this scene before, too many times, and something in the collective consciousness snapped. The massacre at Markale, following the genocide at Srebrenica only weeks earlier, eliminated the last remnants of political patience. Western governments, shamed and furious, recognized that inaction was no longer defensible. Diplomats who had once urged restraint now demanded force. NATO, which had hovered uncertainly at the periphery of the war, finally resolved to strike with overwhelming power. Operation Deliberate Force began on August 30, 1995, with a massive, coordinated barrage unlike anything Bosnia had witnessed from the air. NATO aircraft, F-16s, F-15s, British Harriers, French Mirages, Italian Tornadoes, Dutch F-16s, and Spanish EF-18s roared through the skies in tight formations, targeting Bosnian Serb artillery positions, communication nodes, ammunition depots, radar stations, command posts, and anti-aircraft batteries. For civilians who had lived under the suffocating siege of Sarajevo, the sound of NATO jets was not frightening, it was exhilarating. Residents emerged from basements and bombed-out apartments to watch the streaks of aircraft carving lines across the sky. They listened to the distant booms with a sense of justice long denied. God is bombing them, some whispered emotionally. For once, the thunder above was not the sound of incoming shells but the sound of retribution. The operation was meticulous. NATO had learned from earlier failures that half measures only emboldened the perpetrators. This time, the bombing campaign was relentless, systematic, and strategically precise. The aim was not simply to punish the Bosnian Serb leadership but to dismantle their military capability so thoroughly that they would be forced to negotiate seriously for the first time since the war began. Artillery positions around Sarajevo, those that had shelled the city daily for more than 1,300 days, were among the first targets. These fortified batteries in the hills, long the source of civilians' nightmares, vanished under the weight of laser-guided bombs and cruise missiles. Serbian command posts deep in the mountains were struck with bunkerbuster munitions. Ammunition depots ignited into massive fireballs, their explosions rippling across valleys. Roads used for troop movements were cratered. Bridges strategically important for transporting artillery were destroyed. Radar installations were rendered useless by anti-radiation missiles. The Bosnian Serb army, expecting limited strikes like those seen in previous years, was stunned by the scale and intensity of the assault. Panic spread as communication lines collapsed and supply routes were obliterated. Soldiers abandoned positions that had been maintained for years. Commanders fled their posts. Anti-aircraft gunners fired aimlessly into the sky, unable to track jets that flew faster than their equipment could respond. NATO pilots spoke later of the surreal sensation of flying over territory so heavily militarized yet so disoriented by the sudden shift in power. Operation Deliberate Force did not occur in a vacuum. On the ground, the Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, ARBH, and the Croatian Army, HV, launched coordinated offensives that drastically altered the map of the war. Encouraged by NATO's air support, Bosnian government forces advanced in central Bosnia, retaking territory lost years earlier. Croatian forces struck through western Bosnia, targeting key towns like Sipovo, Jej, and Drvar. The long stagnant front line suddenly moved with unprecedented speed. Bosnian Serb forces, demoralized and fragmented, retreated or surrendered in large numbers. The momentum shifted decisively. But as NATO jets continued their sorties, diplomatic pressure mounted behind the scenes. U.S. envoy Richard Holbrooke embarked on intense shuttle diplomacy across Sarajevo, Belgrade, and Zagreb. Holbrooke, a forceful, relentless negotiator, recognized that military power alone could not end the war. It needed to be paired with a diplomatic strategy that compelled all sides to negotiate. The airstrikes created the leverage required for diplomacy to function. Holbrooke's meetings were tense, volatile, and often perilous. He confronted Slobodan Milosevic directly, making it clear that further massacres would result in even more devastating NATO action. Milosevic, under pressure from the bombings, international outrage, and Serbia's economic crisis, began to shift. He distanced himself publicly from Bosnian Serb leaders Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, though he continued to protect them. Still, the pressure was undeniable. Something had changed. Throughout Operation Deliberate Force, civilians in Sarajevo felt an emotional shift they had not experienced in years: hope. The siege that had defined their existence for nearly 4 years suddenly felt fragile, its machinery cracking under NATO's weight. Snipers went silent. Artillery fire ceased or became sporadic. Civilians walked streets previously deemed impossible to cross. Children emerged from basements into sunlight. The atmosphere in Sarajevo transformed almost overnight. Yes, the war was still present: fear, hunger, grief, but there was a sense that the world had finally turned its gaze toward justice rather than neutrality. Not everyone reacted with relief. In Pale, the Bosnian Serb political leadership raged, calling the NATO strikes illegal and threatening retaliation. Propaganda broadcasts urged civilians in Serb-held areas to resist. Some Serbian families fled towns near targeted sites, fearing escalations. But even within the Bosnian Serb army, many soldiers realized that resistance would only lead to more destruction. Their air defenses were inadequate. Their ammunition was dwindling. Their leadership was fragmented. The myth of Serb invincibility, a narrative crafted since the early days of the war, collapsed under the relentless bombing. NATO's campaign continued for 2 weeks, with more than 3,500 sorties flown and dozens of strategic sites destroyed. By mid-September, the Bosnian Serb command structure was severely crippled. On September 14, 1995, NATO suspended airstrikes after Serb forces complied with UN demands to withdraw heavy weaponry from the exclusion zones around Sarajevo. For the first time since the war began, the guns fell largely silent over the city. Sarajevo, once trapped under an unending storm of fire, experienced a quiet that felt alien, almost frightening in its unfamiliarity. Operation Deliberate Force succeeded where years of diplomacy had failed. It forced the Bosnian Serb leadership to take peace negotiations seriously. It signaled that the world would no longer tolerate genocide, mass displacement, and the destruction of civilian life under the guise of ethnic conflict. It paved the way for the Dayton Peace Accords, which would be negotiated only weeks later. But the operation also raised difficult questions. Why had the world waited so long? Why had it taken massacres, genocide, and years of suffering for decisive action to occur? Many historians argue that if such force had been used earlier, perhaps as early as 1992, countless lives could have been saved. Yet for Bosnia's civilians, the significance of Operation Deliberate Force was undeniable. It was the moment when the world's most powerful military alliance said enough. It was the moment when the balance of power shifted irreversibly. It was the moment when the end of the war became visible on the horizon. It did not erase the horrors that came before or the traumas that would continue long after, but it brought the first genuine light to a country submerged in darkness for nearly 4 years. And when NATO jets finally returned to their bases, leaving behind a war whose violent heartbeat had begun to slow, Bosnia exhaled, for the first time in a very long time. The road to the Dayton Accords was not paved with diplomatic triumphs or sudden flashes of political enlightenment, but with fatigue, trauma, relentless pressure, shifting military realities, and the collective exhaustion of a world that had finally realized that Bosnia's war, brutal, haunting, and morally corrosive, could not simply fade away on its own. And as the smoke from NATO's Operation Deliberate Force cleared in September 1995 and the Bosnian Serb artillery withdrew from the hills, encircling Sarajevo, a kind of fragile, uneasy stillness settled over the land, a silence filled not with peace but with anticipation, suspicion, and the bitter knowledge that every side had reached the limits of endurance. The Bosniaks, battered but resilient, had regained substantial territory through offensives supported indirectly by NATO's air power and directly by the Croatian military. The Croats, who had once vied for dominance in Herzegovina, now sought a stable settlement to secure their gains without provoking further international scrutiny. The Bosnian Serbs, demoralized by relentless bombardment and diplomatic isolation, recognized that continued resistance would bring even harsher consequences, and Serbia itself, under the shrewd and self-preserving leadership of Slobodan Milosevic, began calculating that prolonging the war would risk political collapse at home. With winter approaching and front lines still smoldering, the world's diplomats moved with uncharacteristic urgency, and the United States, long criticized for its earlier hesitation, stepped forward with unprecedented resolve, driving the peace process toward a single destination, a remote military base in Dayton, Ohio, where the fate of Bosnia would be sealed behind closed doors. The negotiator entrusted with shepherding this process was Richard Holbrooke, a larger-than-life figure whose tenacity, abrasive charm, and relentless pragmatism had earned him the nickname the Bulldozer. Holbrooke had spent months shuttling between Sarajevo, Belgrade, and Zagreb, holding fiery discussions with Milosevic, President Alija Izetbegović, and Croatian leader Franjo Tudman. He attended funerals, visited mass graves, walked through bombed-out neighborhoods, and listened to survivors' testimonies. He witnessed up close the devastation wrought by ethnic cleansing, and he approached the negotiating table with a clarity that previous mediators lacked. This war had to end, and ending it required forcing the political and military elites responsible for its continuation to confront choices they could no longer avoid. After a series of preparatory meetings in Geneva and New York, Holbrooke finally persuaded the three leaders, Milosevic, Tudman, and Izetbegović, to travel to the United States for comprehensive peace talks. The chosen venue, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, was selected precisely because its isolation and military security made it nearly impossible for delegates to leak details or escape the pressure cooker of negotiations. On November 1, 1995, the delegations arrived. The atmosphere was icy from the beginning. The Bosniak team, led by Izetbegović, carried the grief of a nation devastated by genocide, siege, and displacement. The Croatian delegation carried both confidence from recent military successes and guilt over its own involvement in ethnic cleansing. The Serbian delegation, led by Milosevic, carried the arrogance of a man who had shaped the war from the shadows and now sought to secure his political future by playing the role of peacemaker. The Bosnian Serb leaders Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic were conspicuously absent, excluded by Western diplomats who refused to negotiate with indicted war criminals. Milosevic, eager to portray himself as the indispensable broker, agreed to represent the Bosnian Serbs' interests. This arrangement set the stage for an intense 3-week standoff marked by shouting matches, sleepless nights, strategic bluffing, and emotional appeals. The structure of the talks was grueling. Delegates worked through breakfast, lunch, and dinner, meeting in windowless rooms, poring over maps of Bosnia divided into color-coded patches representing control zones, proposed boundaries, and contested territories. The bitterness in the room was palpable. Every inch of land represented memories soaked in blood, villages destroyed, families expelled, mass graves concealed. Bosniaks demanded a unified, sovereign Bosnia with minimal division. Serbs insisted on maintaining significant territorial autonomy. Croats pushed for recognition of their own entity within Bosnia. Holbrooke and his team navigated this minefield with brute force diplomacy. He pressed Milosevic aggressively, leveraging Serbia's economic desperation and threat of further sanctions. He appealed to Tudman's desire for international legitimacy. He appealed to Izetbegovic's moral authority as the representative of a people who had suffered the most. The most contentious issue was the territorial division of Bosnia. The international community had decided on a basic framework. Bosnia and Herzegovina would remain a single sovereign state consisting of 2 entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bosniaks and Croats, and Republika Srpska, Serbs. The proposed ratio of territory was 51% to the Federation and 49% to Republika Srpska. This arrangement infuriated many Bosniaks, who felt that rewarding ethnic cleansing with nearly half the country was a moral insult. Izetbegovic, deeply spiritual and principled, struggled with the emotional burden of accepting such a compromise. He spent long nights contemplating the agreement, meeting with advisors, praying for guidance. Milosevic, on the other hand, negotiated boundaries as if playing a chess match, seeking to maximize Serb control while avoiding new airstrikes. Tudman, ever pragmatic, worked to secure Croatian interests in central and western Bosnia. The room often erupted in anger. At one point, Holbrooke slammed his fist on the table and declared, "If you do not stop arguing, we will leave you here to let the war continue." The threat was not empty. Winter was approaching, and NATO was prepared to resume bombing if necessary. Outside the negotiation rooms, the delegations lived in dorm-like quarters under tight military guard. They were isolated from the media and even from their own public constituencies. This isolation was intentional. Holbrooke feared that public statements, press leaks, or political grandstanding would sabotage the fragile progress being made. The atmosphere was suffocating. Delegates walked the perimeter of the base in circles for exercise, snow crunching under their feet, guards escorting them at a distance. They smoked cigarettes in tense silence. They drank endless cups of coffee. Some broke down emotionally under the pressure. Advisors fell asleep at conference tables. The base became a closed world, a crucible where the future of Bosnia was being forged inch by inch. The defining moment of the negotiation came during a late-night session when the map of Bosnia lay stretched across a long table. Holbrooke demanded final decisions on the remaining disputed areas: Brčko, Sarajevo's suburbs, parts of Herzegovina. Milosevic resisted giving up strategic corridors. Izetbegovic refused to compromise further. Tudman weighed the political cost of pushing too hard. In that moment, Holbrooke pulled Milosevic aside and spoke bluntly. Serbia's future in Europe depended on this agreement. Milosevic, ever the opportunist, understood. Slowly, grudgingly, the final pieces fell into place. Brčko would receive a special international administration. Sarajevo would be unified under federation control. Republika Srpska would maintain significant autonomy but remain part of Bosnia. No side was satisfied. That, Holbrooke famously said, was the sign of a true compromise. On November 21, 1995, after 21 days of negotiations, the Dayton Peace Accords were initialed. When the delegations emerged from the base, snow was falling lightly, dusting the ground, a quiet contrast to the emotional storm inside. Journalists surrounded them, cameras flashing, capturing the images that would define the end of a war that had claimed over 100,000 lives. The final signing would take place weeks later in Paris, but the agreement reached in Dayton marked the true end of the bloodshed. In Sarajevo, Tuzla, Mostar, and hundreds of shattered villages, people greeted the news with cautious relief. Some cried for joy. Others cried from exhaustion, grief, or disbelief. Nearly everyone wondered what kind of peace could emerge from such a complicated compromise. The Dayton Accords succeeded in one crucial respect: they stopped the war. The guns fell silent. Artillery positions were withdrawn. UN peacekeepers transitioned to NATO's implementation force, Haifa. Roads reopened. Humanitarian aid flowed. Refugees began returning to their towns, walking through ruins where their homes once stood. Mass graves continued to be uncovered, but at least no new ones were being created. Yet the Dayton structure also cemented divisions that would shape Bosnia's political landscape for decades. The two-entity system created a complex, often dysfunctional government with overlapping jurisdictions, ethnic veto powers, and political fragmentation. Many Bosnians, especially survivors of ethnic cleansing, felt that justice had been sacrificed for stability. Others believed that any peace, however flawed, was better than continued war. Holbrooke understood the imperfections of the agreement he had forged. "This isn't a marriage," he said. "It's a divorce." And it was true. The Dayton Accords froze Bosnia's wartime divisions into a political structure that ensured peace but not unity. Still, the alternative had been annihilation. For many survivors, Dayton offered something war never could: the possibility of rebuilding, of grieving in peace, of raising children who would not dodge snipers on their way to school. As winter settled over Bosnia in late 1995, the war's echoes slowly faded. The world moved on. But Bosnians began the long, painful process of healing, a process shaped, for better or worse, by the agreements made behind closed doors on a distant military base in Ohio. The Dayton Accords were a triumph of diplomacy born from tragedy, a flawed but necessary peace, a turning point that ended Europe's darkest chapter since World War II. And though Bosnia's wounds remained deep, the signing at Dayton ensured that its future, however complicated, however uncertain, would be built not on the ashes of war but on the fragile foundation of a peace wrestled from the jaws of destruction. The war in Bosnia ended with signatures on a set of documents in a faraway American city, but for the people who lived through the conflict, its end did not arrive with the sound of pens scratching paper or cameras flashing at Dayton. It arrived in silence, in the fragile quiet of winter mornings when artillery did not thunder, in the uncertain calm of nights when snipers no longer haunted the rooftops, in the stillness of snow settling on destroyed homes, in the slow realization that the world had stopped burning even though the ashes were still warm and the air still tasted of smoke. And yet this silence, beautiful, shocking, eerie, did not feel like victory, because war does not end neatly, and peace does not erase wounds, and Bosnia, emerging from the wreckage, found itself standing in a landscape where every hill, every riverbank, every street corner bore the marks of tragedy, where the ghosts of the dead seemed to linger in the air, whispering their unfinished stories to a world eager to move on. In Sarajevo, the end of the siege brought a surreal mixture of relief and grief. People ventured outside carefully, like animals emerging from burrows after a long winter. Children, seeing open streets without gunfire for the first time, ran freely, laughing, uncertain whether they were allowed to be joyful. Adults walked the same streets more cautiously, unable to forget the memories etched into pavement and walls: a bullet mark here, a bloodstain there, a crater left by artillery, a graveyard growing on a hillside where once a park had been. Some stood at the edge of Sniper Alley, gazing at the now quiet buildings from which death had once rained down, trying to reconcile the peaceful present with the horrors of the past. Others visited the Sarajevo roses, scars of mortar explosions filled with red resin, memorials embedded directly into the asphalt, touching the edges with trembling hands as if touching the skin of a wound still tender. In towns across Bosnia, life resumed in slow, painful fragments. Mostar's divided city remained scarred, its eastern and western halves separated by invisible lines of mistrust even as reconstruction crews began clearing rubble from the banks of the Neretva. The ruins of Stari Most lay underwater like a fallen monument to coexistence, and divers sometimes descended into the cold river to retrieve stones, each one a fragment of memory. Price to survivors returned to neighborhoods emptied of their former neighbors, some houses occupied by strangers, others burned beyond recognition. In Foka, where mosques had been dynamited and cultural heritage erased, the absence of familiar structures created a feeling of disorientation, as if parts of the town had simply been swallowed by an invisible force. Srebrenica, now a place synonymous with genocide, stood in solemn quiet, its remaining residents living beside the fields and forests where thousands had been executed. Many could not bear to stay, others refused to leave, feeling that abandoning their home would give victory to those who had tried to erase them. Bosnia's cemeteries expanded rapidly after the war, their white headstones rising across hillsides like fields of ghosts. The Srebrenica Potokari Memorial Cemetery grew year by year as forensic experts identified remains from mass graves scattered across eastern Bosnia. Families gathered for annual commemorations, clutching coffins containing fragments of loved ones, sometimes just a femur, sometimes a skull, sometimes only a handful of bone fragments painstakingly matched through DNA analysis. Women who had lost not one but several sons wept in long, rolling cries that echoed across the valley. Some prayed in silence. Others screamed at the sky. The grief was bottomless. The world watched these ceremonies with solemn reverence, but the weight of sorrow belonged entirely to the survivors, who carried it like an invisible burden wherever they went. The war had ended, but its legacy shaped every corner of society. Politically, Bosnia became a complex state divided into two entities and further segmented into layers of bureaucracy intended to prevent renewed conflict but often resulting in paralysis. Schools taught separate histories depending on which ethnic group controlled the curriculum. Children grew up learning different versions of the past, inheriting fragments of truth shaped by political agendas. In some towns, former neighbors lived side by side without speaking, offering polite nods at most, their shared history buried under layers of unspoken pain. In others, genuine reconciliation efforts emerged, youth groups crossing entity lines, NGOs facilitating dialogue, religious leaders meeting to rebuild trust, but progress moved slowly, unevenly, often hindered by nationalist rhetoric that persisted like a shadow of the war itself. Economically, Bosnia faced ruin. Factories destroyed by shelling sat rusting. Farms lay overgrown. Mines littered vast rural areas, turning landscapes into deadly traps. The reconstruction effort required billions in international aid, much of which arrived unevenly or was consumed by administrative dysfunction. Still, amid these challenges, Bosnia rebuilt piece by piece. The streets of Sarajevo regained their energy, cafes filled once more with students and artists, music drifting through reopened bars. In Mostar, the painstaking reconstruction of Stari Most became a global symbol of resilience. When the restored bridge was unveiled in 2004, divers once again leaped into the Neretva from its highest point, honoring a tradition interrupted by war. In Tuzla, multicultural youth movements flourished, determined to maintain the city's reputation as a beacon of unity. In small towns, families rebuilt their homes brick by brick, even when the houses around them remained in ruins. But rebuilding was not only physical, it was mental, emotional, spiritual. Thousands of survivors grappled with trauma that surfaced unexpectedly in daily life. A car backfiring sounded like mortar fire, a firecracker triggered panic, a dark alley revived memories of checkpoints or abductions. Many veterans suffered silently, reluctant to seek help in cultures where emotional vulnerability was stigmatized. Women who had endured sexual violence often kept their stories hidden for years, sometimes decades. Children who had grown up under siege or in refugee camps struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and disrupted education. The war lived inside people's minds long after the guns went silent. The diaspora played a crucial role in Bosnia's post-war life. Millions of Bosnians had fled, some to Germany, Sweden, Austria, the Netherlands, Turkey, the United States, Canada. Many never returned, forming tight-knit communities abroad where they taught their children Bosnian language, cooked traditional dishes, celebrated holidays, and carried their memories across oceans. Some sent remittances home, sustaining families still recovering economically. Others returned periodically to rebuild ancestral homes or visit graveyards. A few came back permanently, compelled by nostalgia or responsibility, investing in businesses and schools. Their stories, of survival, adaptation, and resilience, became part of Bosnia's broader tapestry. Justice slowly began to take shape in international courts. The ICTY in The Hague indicted and prosecuted dozens of war criminals, including high-profile figures like Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, providing survivors with a sense of vindication even if the process was painfully slow. Witnesses traveled from Bosnia to testify, recounting horrors in measured, trembling voices. Some felt relief after speaking, others found the experience re-traumatizing. The sentences handed down, sometimes decades in prison, sometimes life, offered symbolic closure but could never undo the suffering endured or bring back the dead. Memory itself became a battlefield in post-war Bosnia. Memorials were built in some places and resisted in others. Competing narratives emerged, shaping how communities remembered, or denied, the past. Some politicians downplayed or distorted events such as Srebrenica, fueling anger and deepening divisions. Yet survivors and activists fought tirelessly to preserve truth, documenting testimonies, creating museums, holding annual commemorations. Through their efforts, Bosnia's story became known worldwide not only as a tale of tragedy but as a warning about the consequences of unchecked nationalism, international inaction, and the fragility of peace. As time passed, a new generation emerged, young Bosnians born after the war, who grew up hearing stories they did not experience firsthand. Some inherited the fears and prejudices of their parents, others rejected them entirely, seeking unity, opportunity, and a future not defined by the shadows of the conflict. They formed bands, started businesses, created art, organized festivals, built tech startups, traveled abroad, pursued education, and reimagined what Bosnia could become. Their aspirations reflected both the weight of history and the possibility of transformation. Yet the ghosts remained. They lingered in the ruins of abandoned houses, in the silence of villages where entire families had vanished, in the forests where unmarked graves still waited to be discovered, in the cracked walls of schools where bullet holes remained as reminders. They lingered in the memories of mothers who still set an extra place at the table, hoping against logic that a missing son might return. They lingered in the eyes of older men who had walked the death march from Srebrenica, haunted by the faces of those who fell beside them. They lingered in Mostar's divided neighborhoods, where children played on opposite sides of unseen borders shaped by old wounds. They lingered in Sarajevo's hills, where snipers once watched over a city that refused to die. They lingered in the songs sung by survivors, in the poetry written during the siege, in the prayers whispered at gravesites. But the ghosts also carried lessons. They reminded Bosnia that unity, once shattered, is fragile and precious. They reminded Europe that peace cannot be taken for granted. They reminded the world that never again is a promise easily broken. They reminded future generations that hatred grows slowly, silently, invisibly, until one day it explodes, and everything familiar becomes unrecognizable. And so Bosnia, a land of rivers, mountains, bridges, mosques, churches, and memories, moved forward carrying its ghosts with dignity. Not erasing them. Not ignoring them. But living alongside them, acknowledging their presence while refusing to let them define the future. Because Bosnia's story did not end with Dayton. It lives on in the people who continue to build, to love, to remember, to hope. And in the quiet moments, when dawn breaks over the rebuilt Stari Most or sunlight glints on the gravestones of Potokari, the ghosts seem to whisper not only of sorrow but of resilience, a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, the human spirit endures.